fully started. Perfect.
Okay, we're coming up on 3:05. Ameil, I'm going to get your slides up now.
All right, hello everyone, and welcome to today's event, Beyond the Penal and the Carceral, Alternatives to Criminalization to Address Social Need. Thank you all for attending on this Friday afternoon. Just before we jump into the event, I just want to ensure all attendees have the opportunity to experience and participate in this event. So I'm just briefly going over the features we are using in this webinar, and this information has just been posted in the chat as well. So to access the chat function, which is how we ask you submit your questions during the Q&A session, please click on the icon on your menu panel titled chat to bring up that chat box on your screen. You're welcome to submit questions throughout the event. However, panelists will not address the questions until the Q&A period toward the end of the event after all three of our speakers have presented. And just a reminder, this event is being recorded. As an attendee, your video is not shown. However, your questions sent through the chat may be addressed live on this webinar. So with that, I'm just going to pass things over to Bonny Ibhawoh to formally introduce today's event.
Hello, my name is Bonny Ibhawoh, and I'm the director of the McMaster Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice. And it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this conversation, this important conversation. Although this event is happening virtually, we are all rooted in land and physical space. So I would like to begin by acknowledging that McMaster University, where our center is housed, is situated in the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and the Nishabi nations, and within the lands protected by the ditch with one spoon wampum. It is an agreement among all allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources of the Great Lakes. I would like to thank distinguished panelists for joining us today. We are delighted to have two very accomplished scholars and practitioners who've been thinking about the challenges of criminalization and incarceration in our society to talk about these very important issues. In their previous and continuing work, Dr. Ameil Joseph and Professor Rinaldo Walcott bring diverse academic, policymaking, practitioner, and activist perspectives to these very important questions. Their insight will guide our reflections today on a solution-focused conversation on systemic racism within the criminal justice system, policing, prison systems, and surveillance technologies. The fact that we have over 150 attendees registered for this event is an indication of how important and topical these issues are in our society today and frankly, around the world. So once again, I'd like to thank the panelists for taking the time to join us, to lead this very important conversation. And I'd like to thank you for joining us this evening. I look forward to the conversation and to the question and answer sessions. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks to Bonny for that introduction, and Rinaldo for being here. Sarah sent her last minute regrets. She's dealing with a urgent matter. I wanted to start, really to express my gratitude to Rinaldo and Bonny, Professor Walcott, Professor Ibhawoh. I wanted to begin by sharing with you a brief discussion about the frustrating proposal that is often mistakenly suggested as part of abolitionist struggles. And these proposals are themselves just re-articulations of carceral and penal colonial structures of state, through psychiatry or child welfare or social work or mental health or legal professionals. And during recent times, counter positions to defunding the police have suggested that we need police to deal with crises, that they respond to mental health issues in the community. And a counter to this has been, if you could hit the slide for me, that carceral and penal enforcers, kill people with mental health issues when they could be helped. There are those such as Abdurrahman Ibrahim Hassan and Suleiman Fakiri, who suffered with and from mental health issues, who were killed inside carceral institutions. The next slide. But Ijaz Chowdhury, Regis Korchinski, Paquette, Andrew Loku, Chantal Moore, and Clive Mensah were killed via police, either in the street or in their home when seeking care for mental health issues. So you have Black, Indigenous, and people of color described as potentially dangerous due to their mental health concerns, instead of in need of support or care. And this stigma receives no corporate campaign. The next slide. We have a number of examples where recently scholars and activists have laid out quite plainly for us the histories and present day consequences and realities of the pervasiveness of racism and anti-Blackness in particular. Specifically, Desmond Cole describes in detail the ways Abdurrahman Abdi, a man with mental health issues, was killed by police. Professor Walcott writes about a number of examples, but Jermaine Carby, who was killed by police, also someone experiencing mental health issues, and who was talked about in relation, specifically to his toxicology report. And thematically continuous are the ways by which racism ejects the implementation of concern or care when mental health issues are present. Instead, suffering becomes an exponential threat, worthy of violence and further dehumanization, the kind already primed within penal and carceral enforcers and overseers. And the next slide. And we've seen this locally, as Robin Maynard has described in Policing Black Lives. Shavrana Abdi was killed by police in Hamilton, a Black trans woman who was also talked about in the media in relation to gender and HIV status and race in ways that relied upon dehumanization to render the fact that police dragged them down the flights of stairs, face first before their death, obscure. And the next slide. One deeply problematic take that has been advanced during this period is that the need for police is somehow a must due to the history of deinstitutionalization, which emptied many institutions for those living with mental health issues. People refer specifically to the 60s and the 70s without the necessary, that period they talk about as, a deinstitutionalization, an emptying of the institutions without the necessary resourcing of things like supportive housing and community mental health care. So it's a kind of semi-accurate historiography, but it is both somewhat erroneous and quite dishonest as well. In my public debate in The Spectator, I offered, the fact that police have no business responding to mental health crises just because they are deemed crises. The next slide. I offered that, care cannot be given when care cannot be offered. That if mental health care is what we are worried about, then we should invest in those that do this work and do it well, but not without considering what else is at stake and what else is at the table. The next slide. The ways we think about the pervasiveness of this violence and the way it's systemic has to also be considered. This debate, that one that I'm referring to, actually arose from the attentions to the disproportionate harms that Black and Indigenous and other people of color with mental health issues and people with disabilities experience that result from systemic issues within police responses to mental health needs. And the next slide. And there are sources to this racial, gendered, sanist, ableist dehumanization that are fed. They're fed constantly, persistently via confluence of many trajectories. They often operate on their own, but when they reveal their confluence, they are profoundly more dangerous to some, as they are corrupt across state mechanisms of control and their enforcers. There are people that know what they are doing and are skilled to help for sure. However, if those professions and disciplines are not functioning with an analysis that appreciates the role of dehumanization across policing, but also across allied carceral professions and institutions in psychiatry, in legal practice, then we often do not undo or reduce violence in those encounters. We remake them and remodel them in different kinds of ways. The next slide. And we've been able to name and acknowledge for some time that Canada's early asylum and colonial administrators were often one and the same, and they communicated with other asylum and colonial administrators both at home and abroad in the US and the UK, in parts of Western Europe regularly in the effort to share information on how to run asylums efficiently as part of conquest projects, of nation building projects, as part of worldwide colonial projects. And the confluence of racial eugenic policing and practice and law was forged in this alongside these moments of conquest within nation building, alongside the implementation of relations of rule. And as we know, the impetus was to use policy or all agencies under social control to control 4 types and kinds of people via a belief in hereditary or genetic threat and danger. In the early 1900s, I refer to this example often, you know, as eugenics spread widely, as immigration to Canada grew, and alongside the fear of the immigration of freed, formerly enslaved Black people, as those things took hold in Canada, they took those fears and they made them, and they put them in the law. The Immigration Act of 1910 just laid it out. The conflation of ideas of hereditary defectiveness attached to newcomers, to refugees, to immigrants, assigned to, you know, lumping together ideas of undesirability, under this notion of prohibited classes, the prohibited classes of undesirables. And they use these words like persons mentally defective and diseased persons and persons physically defective. They threw in there criminals and prostitutes or pimps or procurers and beggars and vagrants and charity immigrants. Everyone who might be in need was thrown into this bucket of threat, of not want. And in the same year, this is 1910, right? Howard Odum puts out his racist book through Columbia University, describing specifically Black people in eugenic terms, conflating addiction, criminality, and mental disorder via the language of dehumanization, to argue for an inferiorizing gaze, right? Those are just 2 kinds of examples of a thing happening at that same period that sometimes we refer to in fields like disability studies and mad studies as eugenics, but don't always name the other coinciding racial components. And these ideas were wielded readily to enlist the logics of eugenics and the rationale of dehumanization to permission to authorize and legitimate death. And these things are widely wielded now on children, you know, people inside institutions and outside institutions, on the street, on buses, in the community. And I've written specifically about this, also how the use of internal inquiries often serve to reinforce racial eugenic ideas, to reproduce a sense of biological threat or lack, dehumanized and worthy of punishment or unworthy of care. The issue is that racial eugenics is now embedded among all carceral, penal and juridical structures across many professions of state control in ways that are often scattered throughout several pieces of legislation. But all of these are things that need to be undone as well. Let me share with you one example of what I mean by these continuities in the present. So these ideas have shifted their nomenclature, but their meanings and implied ideas of threat continue their historical work. The Immigration and Refugee Protection Act provisions in section 36(1), if you care about where, that a permanent resident or a foreign national is inadmissible on grounds of this bucket of ideas that surrounds serious criminality, for being convicted of a criminal offense, It can be inside or outside of Canada. Before, it was where the sentence could be 10 years of imprisonment. But in Canada today, if the sentence could be something where you could be sentenced for more than 6 months, now that also qualifies as serious criminality. And this concept of serious criminality is offered across pieces of law and practice that allows for historically entrenched ideas to be remapped into its vagueness for what we can appreciate as sometimes rather transparent applications and daily uses. So this word serious criminality in sections 54 to 61, it goes on to outline the permissions in the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act to authorize violence, to detain, to remove a foreign national. It allows for an officer of Immigration, Refugee, and Citizenship Canada to order detention on a person for things like medical assessment or medical examination, under any grounds they deem reasonable for a person that might be quote unquote seriously criminal. So if the person is deemed to be a threat to the public or unlikely to attend hearings, or they deem them as somehow necessary of examination or somehow at risk of leaving or not attending other proceedings, they can initiate these powers. And the minister also has the authority to impose any conditions that they consider necessary on a foreign national upon release. And we've known for some time that current immigration law in Canada requires these medical guidelines that state that a foreign national is just inadmissible on health grounds if their health condition is considered in this basket of things that's considered dangerous. So if there's someone who's perceived to be a danger to public health or a danger to public safety, or and then the other bit that people have been resisting for some time is this notion of excessive demand. If the person is reasonably expected to cause excessive demand on health or social services. And the current Canadian immigration guidelines include a unique piece of specificity. And they say what they mean by excessive demand, including ongoing hospitalization or any kind of institutional care for physical and mental illness. And section 38, that one right there reminds us all that mental health issues or mental illness is directly tied to notions of threat and danger and burden, bound to inspection and detention and removal. The threat of removal is persistent. What this also does, it empowers the border police, the CBSA, the border cops. The Canada Border Services Agency is now allowed to collect and use information from a variety of sources to identify people based on these notions of serious criminality or danger to the public safety or public health. And neither of these ideas of public include foreign nationals who may live in Canada or have been here for decades. The CBSA polices borders, of course, well beyond the borders themselves, making decisions on admissibility through surveillance, perpetual surveillance, on an ongoing basis for foreign nationals who live in Canada. And the CBSA is not only responsible for deportation, for the removal orders, but they also do the detention, and they chase people who they consider a flight risk, while these admissibility claims and cases are being adjudicated. Now, how this has been sustained is the kind of thing that should be disturbing to most. So the faster, there was a law called the Faster Removal of Foreign Criminals Act. It received royal assent in June 2013. Pay attention to these dates. And the act amends the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act And it references things like the Canadian Security Intelligence Services Act, Protecting Canada's Immigration System Act, Jobs, Growth and Long-Term Prosperity Act. The summary tells you what it's about. It serves to limit the review mechanisms for certain foreign nationals and residents who are inadmissible on these grounds of serious criminality. And then, the Not Criminally Responsible Reform Act also receives assent in a similar period, around April 2014. It amends the criminal code and the National Defense Act. It adds this new category of high-risk offender contained within the discourse around serious criminality that, when applied to a person, can limit any disposition that grants them any kind of freedom from detainment or incarceration in a prison or mental institution, regardless of a finding of not criminally responsible by reason of mental disorder. So you see what they did there? We have a thing called not criminally responsible by reason of mental disorder, and they recriminalized it. At the same time, a year later, the Anti-Terrorism Act receives royal assent. It amends all these other pieces as well, including how we share information, air travel, evidence, the criminal code, Canadian Security Intelligence Services Act, and the IRPA as well. So it contains a plethora of ambiguities, often offering extreme discretionary authority to these security powers and government professionals. The first point of effect is that this act authorizes the government and institutions to share and disclose or appropriate any information that they deem as related to this notion of serious criminality. So now we've tied issues of mental health to national threat, to possibly terrorists, and everyone can share all this information now. So the Safer Streets and Communities Act, the Faster Removal of Foreign Criminals Act, the Not Criminally Responsible Reform Act, and the Anti-Terrorism Act made drastic changes across the board, to sentencing, to right to appeal, to judicial powers to override decisions based on this notion of serious criminality, and sweeping powers to share what they called security information across agencies and internationally, by all establishing notions, remaking these notions of serious criminality, connecting them to newcomers and immigrants, to people with mental health issues or disabilities, conflating terrorism, and to mostly authorize the use of force and violence. And they use the language of safety and protection to do it, to prohibit classes of people based on ideas of threat and burden and lack, crafted with enough discretionary authority to allow for them to continue to advance racial and eugenic ideas. And it sounds familiar, right? You know what these are? These images here? These are the super jails that Stephen Harper's government helped establish. They also happen to be used as immigration detention centers and claim in documents to meet the needs of detainees with mental health issues. You have, the panopticism in law that I just described, that is also materialized as panopticon in structure and panoptical through the professions that participate in its maintenance. None of this is new. We have long histories of these institutions and professions working together to contain, to exclude, and authorize violence to those they deem undesirable or threat. The next slide. The conflation and practice of medical inspection for detention, for exclusions or dehumanization with medical treatment or care. These kinds of specific things are also not new, but often omitted from analyses that suggest that one is a solution to the other. That, you know, referring people to a mental health service is something different than police, right? Because sometimes they aren't so different, depending on who you're referring to and what kind of mental health care we're talking about. I'm currently working on a study of immigration detention and mental health and colonial eugenics in practice. And we spoke to, you know, immigration detainees, who all of whom were Black and people of color. And what they described was not care at all for their mental health. What they described to us was tantamount to torture. And they acted to resist, you know, through hunger strikes and resistance. The staff inside the prisons or the immigration detention centers, which are one of the same, would put the best food on the menu to torment them. Yet the stories they told us were of resistance to that form of dehumanization. And they told us about the support that they gave to each other. And sometimes we see this reported on publicly, but rarely do we ask the questions of the institutions that remain obscured from public view to interrogate the violence and harm they make and remake in these moments. What I hope is for people to be able to see through the superficial statements and more performative solidarities that do the thing of suggesting police should not be responding to mental health concerns, which is true, like CAMH did, but without interrogating their own complicities with dehumanizing violence and carceral and penal practice. These two articles here probably came out within a month of one another, maybe a couple of months of one another, where CAMH puts out a statement saying, you know, police shouldn't be responding to mental health stuff. And then, you know, a report about confining 2 service users to their rooms for weeks at a time in isolation during the pandemic. I also hope, you know, that people think through some of these things and they connect to the fact that this history is bound to these ideas. You know, this plaque at the college and Spadina location of CAMH honors a man, C.K. Clark, who argued for everything I'm talking about, immigration restrictions, as well as restrictions for who could access social assistance for newcomers and immigrants, because he believed they were carriers of hereditary defectiveness that would somehow influence or impact or infect the Canadian public. And those looking for alternatives for abolition must also refuse any alternatives that enable dehumanization via the logics and practices of racial and colonial eugenics. That includes me. You know, it's a troubling thing when you're attached to a field like social work that is bound to this infrastructure in child welfare, in mental health, in the education systems where we operate as interlocutors with these systems. And the hypocrisy can be called out and resisted at every instance, at every one of these moments, and we should do it. We should do it more often. But I'll stop there. I think our next talk will be from Professor Rinaldo Walcott, professor in the Women and Gender Studies Institute at the University of Toronto, whose research is in the area of Black diaspora, cultural studies, gender and sexuality. He's authored you know, several influential books, and I could spend some time talking about why having him here today is an honor. What I'll say is that Professor Walcott, like no one else, is constantly asking many to think beyond the limits of what we've been traditionally presented with, to imagine more. And what I respect is that his analysis and work respects people and life as a basis for what is asked for. It counters what we've been made to believe, which stands on a basis that we're unworthy of such respect. And I'm grateful for that embedded analysis that always bets on people to imagine something different. So thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Professor Joseph, for that really gracious introduction. I also want to thank the McMaster Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice and the Hamilton Center for Civic Inclusion and the Disability Justice Network of Ontario for putting together this panel and conversation. And I'm really sorry that Sarah Jammeh had that event at the last minute and can't be here with us, because I think what Ameil, what you just spoke to and what I'm about to speak about and what I thought Sarah might address would bring us into what I feel is a really urgent conversation, especially given what happened last week in Palestine, and the fallout continues, and of course the ongoing colonization there. Yeah, my comments are entitled Values. And I want to begin with 3 very brief guide quotes. The first is from Lyndon Barrett. Always presupposing contingency, competition, and convergence, value proves merely form, a normative design, forcefully emergent from and provisionally triumphant over a relative parataxis of others. And the second is from a mentor of mine, Roger Simon. And I'm just going to say one thing about it before I read it, because the it in what I'm going to read would not be clear, but it comes from an essay where the late Roger Simon is responding to how to engage with the question of what was then the commemoration of Columbus's voyages into the Americas in 1992. And the it there references alternative challenges to the normative commemoration. Roger writes, instead of offering the deadening mantle of guilt, he's writing from the place of a white Jewish man, it challenges us to act in the name of a collective responsibility, to continue the quest for justice and the establishment of new forms of interdependency, which honor the dignity of the others, there's not S in S. And the third comes from Sylvia Wynter. What should constitute fully modern human beings is now the necessary condition at this conjuncture, both of our species' survival and concomitantly of our inter-altruistic co-identification as a species. Those 3 guide quotes are really informing what I'm about to say to you. 1989. I think about 1989 a lot. I think about the actual dismantling of parts of the Berlin Wall. I think about what the dismantling has come to represent symbolically for alternatives to the culture of capitalism. I think about what has intensified in the aftermath of '89. I think about what 1989 has meant for politics at this moment. I think especially about what 1989 has meant for what we shorthandedly call left politics. I think about what 1989 has meant for how we for how we imagine, for our political imaginations, especially. I think about 1989 a lot and about its reordering and reordering of value and values. My comments today are targeted at that group of people who alternatively go by the left, progressives, and other names that place them outside the political formation in representative democracies that constitutes a center where one's politics falls either left of center, right of center, or center. Such a political formation already imagines a settled political landscape that only requires reform, polish, and refinement. The left or progressive formulation that I'm pointing to is one invested in a notion, an idea of transformation, reconstruction, and importantly, invention. And it necessarily sits outside of the relative settlement of representative democratic politics. Most importantly, the distinction I'm making here has everything to do with how one might practice politics at both the imaginary or conceptual or theoretical stage, at the practical stage, and as a praxis. 1989 orients my thinking. It is among a number of talismanic years that orient me. Among those years are 1492, 1945, the 60s just holds that special place, 1982, 1992, and so on. These years at different points mark what I think of as political transitions and concentrations that we need to reckon with if we are to reinvent the world anew. The idea of reinvention is one that I'm committed to and one that I understand as entirely within our reach if we so choose. So back to 1989. The actual and symbolic fall of the Berlin Wall cannot be denied for the world-changing event that it was and remains. Often understood as a reunification of Germany, it was that in part. It remains important to see it also as the culmination of a world system process, beginning with the official end of the Cold War, perestroika, glasnost, the emergence of new European nation states, the further cementing of the European Union, new free trade agreements, and trading blocs, and ultimately the emergence of a singular capitalist world system, unlike anything we had witnessed prior to that moment. But a world system that kept intact racialized, unequal distribution of the Earth's resources. The fall of the wall was then the final nail in any alternative economic arrangement or arrangements, fantasy or desire that some of us had that would allow for different and more equal arrangements for planetary life. The fall of the wall marked the disappearance of another economic order, even if some people argue that it wasn't. Capitalism appeared to have triumphed and to become the globe's total way of living a life. Of course, the outposts of alternative economic arrangements carry on. Here I think of Cuba. But what I'm signaling here is not merely economic difference, but rather the lack of a distinction between the economic and the cultural. In the aftermath of the wall, the culture itself became capitalism. No longer was or is there a need for a distinction between the economic sphere and the cultural sphere. They are now one and the same. The fall of the wall capped a certain kind of political horizon. It repositioned or political imaginaries within the confines of capitalist culture, and our political demands became wedded to its limits or what was and is possible within its limits. As I have suggested elsewhere concerning neoliberal economics and culture, I argue that it has only been successful insofar as it has interrupted our imaginations, imprisoning us in a set of boundaries set on its own terms that we can never breach but keep reaching for. All of this is to point to the problematic that even many of our actions within movements come to match a template that might be drawn from capitalist culture, with rank star systems, branding, proprietorship, and replications of the very logics that we claim we are seeking to upend and transform into better ways of living together. The question of value and values then becomes at stake. The processes that I'm addressing here were well on the way before the fall of the wall, but in my view, and the view shared by others, intensified in the aftermath. So for instance, in North America since at least the 60s, what came to be characterized as the culture wars that continue well into today, we're well on the way before the fall of the wall. And in my understanding of this, these things combine eventually, but we might be able to come to that in the question period. Central to these processes was the devolution and disinvestment in the welfare state and the ongoing intensified abandonment, criminalization, and making of wasted various populations of not white peoples, chief among them Black populations, populations of the poor, workers, and all those furthest removed from the means of capitalist production and reproduction. These archipelagos of poverty, populated with lives now made waste, have been the populations that are the root and the base of what a left or progressive politics will and does contend with, or should and will contend with. And these wasted populations are the ones that must be at the center of left politics and its concerns if we are to make a new world. The wasted populations are the populations that challenge both capitalist value and its cultural values and make necessary for us the urgent need to produce a new account of what value could and might mean. We cannot actually combat what goes under the umbrella of criminalization and its long reach into our lives if we do not work to re-signify what value means, actually is, and how it's practiced, experienced, and lived. I have repeatedly turned to the late literary and culture critic Lyndon Barrett's work on Blackness. And just to do a kind of strange little thing, even though people know that I'm not really committed to nation, but just to do a strange little thing, many people don't know that Lyndon Barrett was actually a Black Canadian who grew out west, I think in Regina, went to school at York University as an undergraduate, and then went to the US where he studied and worked and spent the rest of his life until he passed. I've repeatedly turned to Lyndon's work to think the problem of value as something more than the economic, but always being pressed by the economic as another logic of value or that which is valued. Barrett is clear that Black people became caught up in at least one set of double binds of value, that of being economic commodity and something else, the non-human valuelessness that provides the value to others. So in a sense, Lyndon argued that Black people had to be made valueless in one instance so that others could find the value in themselves. At the same time, Black people were valuable as commodities That's the double bind of value. So Linden writes, and I quote, Linden tells us, I should say, value, that is to say, inevitably remembers itself by dismembering the other, end quote. To think value as the dismemberment of another is to recognize its non-economic work, even as economics undergirds its evaluative mechanism. This is something more than who is important and who is not. This is the work of the racial hierarchy that Las Casas sets in place, and that remains the bedrock of our contemporary classificatory systems of personhood. Value as an ideological device in part works to distribute that which we should care about, embrace, and place in high esteem. But value also works to keep in place an account of the world so that its ongoing monstrous procedures might function as the instinctive way of also being in the world. Thus, Barrett further writes, and I quote, "Monstrously, the problematics of value are the problematics of many others, of monstrous conditionals, of monstrous permutations. The troublesome structure and movement of value are dizzyingly self-reflective," end quote. And Barrett produces an account of value and non-value that makes Blackness appear. And thus he continues, "Value is violence, then it is not. Value is violence, then it is form. Value courts violence, then, in an immediate second appearance, court in form, tries to belie as other and other in past," end quote. So I read Barrett as offering us a way to think the production of Black value and beyond it as a significant problem of the modern. In Barrett's hands, value becomes a cultural form and a practice, one that is bound up with ethics and with care, one that notices how the economic and the social function to produce and maintain the monstrous, which in my view is another way of saying modernist value is one caught up in the production and the logic of criminalization. So this brings me to criminalization, of which I do not have much to say. We only need criminalization as an idea, a process, and a practice, because the world we now inhabit is founded on, built on the values of theft and the theft of value. The theft that is the foundation of the global unequal distribution of the Earth's resources means we need logics and practices to hold that unequal distribution in place. One of the names for some of that unequal distribution is criminalization. In a world where unequal distribution is, in a world where unequal distribution is the foundation of the past, it is also necessary to have criminalization. So my argument is we can't have unequal distribution of the Earth's resources without having something called criminalization, a set of ideas, a cobbling together of ideas that helps to justify why unequal distribution makes sense reasonably and logically. Of course, this does not necessarily mean that harm disappears from the world, which is the other thing that criminalization is supposed to mark. But what it does mean is that we can invent new ways of dealing with harm in the absence of our current modes and practices of what we call criminal justice. So harm in the formulation that I'm offering you can sit outside of the normative logic of criminalization, which I'm arguing is a practice and a mode of maintaining gross unequal distribution, inequitable distribution. The complex and compounded indices of what is now called criminalization is the ongoing historical accumulation of colonial processes now enacted and exacted on wasted, reserved, resistant populations, segmented and differentiated through racial and cultural logics, both imposed and internalized, but only necessary because of the very process of their coming into being. And the process of their coming into being is that unequal distribution, that theft of value, and that theft and the values of theft. That is that we're mostly who we are in this moment then because of colonization and its ongoing processes. Back to the left. That on the left, that our politics and political imaginations find themselves, I would argue, still trapped in white supremacist capitalist culture as the very ground from where we proceed is a kind of defeat that we on the left have not dealt with well as yet. Our language and political imaginaries have reproduced with some significant adaptations the racial hierarchies, practices, and new forms of deference and claims. So that our solidarities are often merely the opposite side of the very thing we claim to be working against. Let me repeat that. Our language and political imaginaries on the left have reproduced with some significant adaptations the very same racial hierarchies, practices, and I would argue new forms of deference and claims, so that our solidarities are often merely the opposite side of the very thing we claim to be working against. What many of us have not been attempting to do is to think this world anew. To think in any sustained fashion the brutal and terrible intimacies of our encounters and the reality of a no return requires a different account of the world. It's in part my argument that our politics has refused to begin at the point where we are right now, and instead is locked in a distorted account of our history that keeps us in a kind of feedback loop. On property, I wrote of the need for a new idea of the commons. Since what historians have called the enclosure of the commons, where monarchies in Europe appropriated specific lands for their use and benefit, the commons is both idea and a practical means of organizing life, has consistently been something we've had to struggle with over, because the commons is the terrain that makes life life. A renewed idea of the commons for our times brings along with it a different idea of how we might collectively live better together. And that includes living better together for the earth as well. I would argue that 1989 further segmented the commons into nation states and trading blocs, and thus into arenas of policing, both global and local. Like after 89, for instance, I know many people think that it was at 2001 that we began to really seriously notice border guards in all kinds of quote unquote first world places. But I would argue that it was after 1989 that kind of global expansion of policing became really important. This segmenting means that collective responsibility for our shared resources as a basis of how we care for each other became further sites of antagonism, to put it mildly. The resources of a renewed commons are not only one of what we call the natural resources of the earth. They also include the world's technological and accumulated wealth, accrued through more than 500 years of the exploitation of most of us. The realization of this vision of the commons, of a renewed commons, a new commons, necessitates a profound shift in how we understand life. And abolition is the name we give this wish for transformation at this particular moment. A renewed vision of the commons is a call to invention and reinvention, to unmaking and remaking, to ending the world as it is, and to making the world that we need. It recognizes that how we presently live together was conceived, installed, and learned over hundreds of years, and therefore it can be unlearned. We can learn new things. We can learn new ways of coexisting. So renewed vision and practice based on stewardship of the global commons and an ethic of care that begins to attending to the most vulnerable among us first, what we used to call the welfare state, could open us up to an altogether different and better way of living together. A philosophy in politics that takes the idea of the commons, meaning the collective ownership of the earth's resources by all of us, seriously again returns us to an order of knowledge of collective ownership, as the commons previously suggested prior to capitalism, in which we are collectively responsible for managing the natural and social resources that make life possible. To arrive there, we would be arriving at the possibility of building a new and a different kind of society. This means we would have to transform our thinking about how we care for each other. The idea of the commons brings with it a different kind of moral and ethical order, and a consciousness that demands a different relationship to life and to living better together. Our stewardship of the commons would return life as we know it, meaning the human species or the life form called the human, to our natural place as one species among others. In this perspective, the language of ownership disappears, and instead we inhabit a new perspective of life, one concerned with the well-being of all life forms, human and otherwise. This perspective draws from indigenous cultures around the world, but it is also significantly influenced by communism. That other paradigm prior to 1989, insofar as the logic of the communal is what makes a different kind of life possible. What I'm suggesting, obviously, is that individualism is a learned cultural trait and practice. Communalism can also be learned and practiced. Of course, this is not a change that will happen overnight. What I'm outlining here will take time, but I feel strongly that it is the direction that we must move to ensure our planet's survival. We need to invent a new ethics of care, or a new way of being in common and difference with each other. This new way of being must and will eschew forms of authoritarian arrangements in which people are grouped and classified as less than others and resources distributed unevenly on that basis. Such a perspective requires a new account of life, as Stuart Hall would say, as history has intervened. Our current task is to narrate a different account of how we can live better together collectively. So following Cynthia Winter, we can offer a different account of life and work to make that make that account the dominant mode of how we inhabit the planet as a species. Such a different account demands that we imagine anew our mutuality of relations across populations, species, and other modes of life on the planet. Finally, and this is the part of this talk that I hope will generate some conversation, because it's the part where I take some risk and where I argue that we have to take risks. So finally, we're going to have to risk something to make something better than we have. Something we all know we need, and something that will save the planet. Gayatri Spivak has asked us to risk our specialism. That risk is going to have to begin with risking identity, and instead provide another and different account of our shared and collective histories. Risking identity's seductions, its claims on us, risking its steadfastness, and risking that we can collectively reinvent ourselves beyond the identities that have evolved from the aftermath of Columbus's onslaught in the Americas, is one that scares many. However, those very identities are in part the production of our ongoing colonial matrix. If we are to save this planet, we must begin to grapple with the trap that identity is, how it cages us, and how under some conditions, it always already preempts the possibility of another world coming into being. In this regard, I think we need to imagine a new and different kind of solidarity, as I think Tamara Napa offers points us to in some of her recent lectures and interviews. And in so doing, a different and new account of the commons in a post-Columbus migratory world. One of the things that I am more and more keenly willing to risk begins with the knowledge that the people and the institutions that made us and named us savage, nigger, uncivilized, barbaric, native, are the same ones that have now accepted and partially made us and name us and also identify us as Black, Indigenous, POC, LGBT, and so on. The Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment, modernist European expansion that categorized us remains steady in its ongoing categorizations and in its ability to induct us into its practice of the human, all who will retain its foundational principles of brutal, unequal distribution of the worst resources. So let me read that again. The Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment, modernist European expansionist project that categorized us remains steady in its ongoing categorizations and in its ability to induct us into its practice of the human, all who will maintain its foundational principles of brutal, unequal distribution of the Earth's resources. This, in essence, is why we can have US empire in blackface, What remains elusive for many of us then is the difficulty of forging cross-cultural resonances, as Wilson Harris would put it, from a partially shared and ongoing brutal history into this contemporary moment where racial hierarchy positioned those deselected as furthest from Black as more worthy of a life. This is the legacy of Las Casas, all the way to Trump and Joe Biden et al., and all inclusive, including Obama. My argument here is not one for a colorblind political consciousness, but rather for a political consciousness that recognizes the nigger, the native, the coolie, the savage, the uncivilized, the oriental, the barbaric, as all sharing something in common. And it's from that commonality that a different politics is possible, again, quoting from Hall, without guarantees. You see, Stuart Hall already had embedded in his account of how we might remake the world a critique of coalition and solidarity. And yet he had an insistence that we must try. So yes, let's just try. What I'm certain of is that most of our current left responses to the conditions of degradation that the majority of us are forced to live daily will not in any way shape or form be adequately addressed, nor produce the conditions and new foundations for transformation if we continue to respond and to activate desires within the entrapments of late modern capitalist culture, one being played out on the terms of the master conception of European humanism. Or one small task, collectively executed, is to risk something of ourselves, and to risk it now. Thank you.
Thank you. I have my own thoughts and questions, but maybe we won't start there. We can ask if anybody has any particular questions they want us to address up front. We can put that in the chat, and I can help us navigate some of those. And while that's happening, I was thinking about. I've been thinking about these things for some time, not in the same way. I learned a lot today. I've been thinking about the problem of, the way I was introduced to aspects of social justice. There's both the upbringing that comes from, being a descendant of indentured laborers, and what my parents and grandparents shared with us in those struggles and out of that life. And then there was the stuff that, I was introduced to in undergrad via Marxism, then critical theory, and only later, much later in grad school, were you introduced to anything that spoke the word race or colonial. Well, that was my experience anyway. And then you're grappling with, well, how do we begin from a place where we learn this history, where we learn a kind of particular genealogy, a particular timeline, where, somewhere along the line, somebody said, these people need to be worthy of violence, worthy of less, worthy to exploit, to take, to subjugate. And it is from there that value can then be derived, and supremacy erupts in that moment. And so how do we not then depend on these categories of difference and identity to make asks for something different, when that's where we begin. We run into it perpetually, where these moments where, you know, if you question the categories of identity because they were forged in relations of dehumanization through colonial processes to make someone worthy of less. We can't rely on those because they're problematic, and the counters to those are also problems, like you say. But then to name that thing can leave us in the place where you get accused of colorblindness, that we're not naming the disparities as they are. So I don't know how we get out of, we get from here to an idea of a commons and think of solidarity and struggle in a different kind of way. So that's my first part of a question. Like, what do we do with this now? And in these moments when there's counter struggles via white supremacy that like that direction, that would have us ignore all kinds of disparity in order for us to just kind of go along with the way things are. And in the book, your book on property, you signal, the ways that riot has been symbolic and productive, as a way to kind of shake the way things are and try to grapple with something different. So those are two parts. How do we deal with this now? And what of the mechanisms to get from here to there?
Thank you. Look, I think, I want to stress that I'm not trying to make a case for colorblind political practice or political consciousness, that I could only arrive at the argument I am making because I've spent so much time thinking and studying Black life, right? And it's from being deep inside of thinking about what makes Black life possible that I've also arrived at where I am. But the reason I wanted to use that talismanic signal of 1989 is because I think that something happened after 1989 that was well on the way, but became confirmed. So after 1989, Bosnia-Herzegovina, after 1989, we get the end of the formal end of apartheid in South Africa. And South Africa becomes the rainbow nation, a multicultural nation. Shortly after that, we get Rwanda and so on. And what we see is the beginning of a certain kind of global national formations and sedimentations that then play themselves out in places like Canada, the US, Australia, and so on, through what we come to call cultural identity. And that long struggle now presents itself in pithy little phrases like BIPOC, right? So when Lena Barrett talks about parataxis in the little quote that I make from him, a parataxis is like, this kind of thing where things are kind of like of equal weight or something like that. And so because we realized that these histories are different, we came up with, they're different, but they're related, we came up with a way to hold them together. So the acronym BIPOC became that, Black, Indigenous, POC. But what it didn't allow for, it left these things as though they're separate, while gesturing to the fact that they have some relation. And that's where the risk becomes. That's where the risk becomes necessary. So when Stuart Hall says that history intervenes and that there's that politics has no guarantees, it's not, what he's kind of saying to us is that we have to risk recognizing that these things do have a relation. And that because they have a relation doesn't mean that things are going to work out really well at the other end, but we have to risk engaging them to see how they're going to work out. So this is counter to, I would argue that that's counter to what the normative white supremacist state wants us to do. That the normative white supremacist state doesn't actually want us to take the risk of working through our commonality and our difference. That it actually wants us to sit in our difference. Even if our differences stack up and sit alongside each other, it rather prefers that than have us saying, we're going to tussle with this, we're going to wrestle with this and see what comes out at the end to give it that kind of logical progression. And that's a particular kind of risk that I think is really necessary as I see the manner in which the ongoing unequal distribution of resources continually pulls in identity-based groups. So part of what I'm gesturing here to is the fact that this question of values, capitalist value, of white supremacist value, has been a rather flexible value. And that our response has to be one that actually forces it to contract. And contract in a manner that allows us to begin to build the kinds of foundations that are necessary for a new world. It is flexible enough to have blackface empire, but at the lower frequencies or lower levels, it's flexible enough to put in place various kinds of non-white people to manage other various kinds of non-white populations. So it's able to pull people into its values. And those of us on the left who are working against that kind of proposition have to risk something. And what has happened on the left is, and I'm using that term broadly, is that we ourselves have become stuck in the categorizations of white supremacist colonialism. So we continually rebound to our identity populations. And that kind of humanism is always creating a new niche that it can incorporate. In my book, The Long Emancipation, I write about this in another way. I say that, the language of human rights continually creates these populations. And because so much of the human is defined against Blackness, that every time the language of human rights creates a new population, whether it's gay, whether it's trans, whether it's people with disabilities and so on, Black people have to come along and say, me too, me too. But what if we didn't have to come along and say, me too, we belong to that category too. But we kind of refuse that category in terms of something else, in terms of a language that called for a language and a practice that insisted on equal distributions of the resources. That's a risk, but it's a risk that's worth taking at a moment when we have been, and I'm this time for this talk, I'm using 1989, when we have been so stuck in a process of identity claims and a response to the distribution of resources within the horizon of late modern capital based on identity. And so we're stuck. And I want to risk getting us unstuck by saying, let's push against this thing that we're sitting too easily in, which is not to forget history. I don't want to go on, but which is not to forget history, but which can only be deeply informed by history to take that risk.
Huh. I think you answered the question in the chat. Yeah. Which was that, like, what we're risking, what's at risk. I think, what happens a lot is we assume or even demand for struggles of recognition around identity. And then you have asks for representation, whereby, if we have enough of X, then we'll be somewhere else, because we'll hit a moment, maybe a threshold, where there'll be a critical mass of the others at some table that then generate some kind of inertia that becomes change. And some of us have experienced over the last several years that some of those asks don't produce the kinds of things that we have desired. And not because we blame the particular person who's been selected to act in that role, to be the representative, but because because of what is asked of them, to be a singular voice or spokesperson that diffuses any kind of collective representation. And so I like when I think about what we might risk, we would have to give up those moments where we say yes to those things, to the kind of tokenistic representations. Maybe they're not always tokenistic, maybe that's harsh, but maybe because of what they do to struggle, and because of what they do to critique. I would argue as well, for me to critique that person when I've asked for that person to be there, sets us up as we're the problem, we're the enemy, we're the people that don't get along, and we don't have our shit together. And that's the issue. Communities struggling within and across, rather than for anything bigger. These are things that we kind of grappled with, but we didn't. You were presented with, there are problems of rights, there are problems with redistribution of resources, and there are problems of identity and recognition. And one was presented as ethical, the other was presented as economic. And you argued, as if they were not connected at all, not the way you have been talking to us just now. Sometimes, we could take redistribution and recognition from, Jonathan Fraser from early 2000s, that kerfuffle that really didn't do the thing of asking for something else, or what's at stake in a different kind of way.
I think there are a couple of things. One is that the question of risk, going back to the guide quote from Sylvia Winter. Sylvia Winter asked us, when she uses the term inter-altruistic, she's also asking to take a risk, to see the other in ourselves and for the other to see us in themselves. That the question of the inter-altruistic identification as a species in relationship to saving the world. So the way that we have kind of taken up in this moment, I would say since the 60s, this notion of the inter-altruistic has been through a particular logic of representation. That if we get some of the previously excluded persons, populations into the institutions, that inter-altruistically, the institution will begin to shift and change and produce broader mechanisms of inclusion and therefore justice. We've known since the 60s that has actually not been working. But even in our moment, the intensification of things like diversity, equity, and inclusion have continued to push that particular kind of logic. One of the things that happens alongside that, at least in left circles, and this is how I'm gonna come and risk something now. But one of the things that have happened alongside that, at least in left circles, is with the intensification of the circulation of ideas and knowledge and social media and other forms of very speedy and intimate communications, is that we have actually narrowed the range of debate. So that disagreement has now been understood as personal attack. And of course, sometimes disagreement is personal attack, but disagreement is not always personal attack. Sometimes disagreement is the mechanism to continue to work at and work out a problem and to try to make sense of how we might proceed collectively to respond to a situation, a moment, or the long jury of history as a way to intervene into the thing that we're working against. So I'll give you an example of this. You know, in the last US election, you know, the fear of Trump re-election led many Black, really famous Black US intellectuals to make the case that responsible folks had to vote for the Biden-Harris ticket to prevent Trump and fascism. For someone like myself living outside of the US, I experienced that argument as deeply nationalist and as not coterminous with taking seriously Black life and the lives of what I call, following Sylvia Winter, the archipelagos of poverty around the world. Seriously. Now, I know that they would say, well, you know, Trump was going to be worse, but actually we just saw what happened in Palestine. And we know that Biden wasn't any better than Trump. So to raise this question, to ask then a kind of set of concerns around what does this kind of Black intellectual leadership, what are they actually engaging in? It's not personal attack, but it's an attempt to kind of work with the problem of the question as a way to kind of figure out what my other possible political responses might be that might be both in this moment, because nation states haven't disappeared, nationally satisfying, and also internationally coterminous with presenting as much harm as possible. You know, I've seen some young people in social media basically make the case that, for instance, in the context of the US, that Black people should en masse refuse from engaging in the electoral process and thereby fully and totally indict the project of what constitutes the US. The leading intellectuals didn't make that case. Or last night I heard, you know, a leading intellectual of another kind in a really wonderful conversation talk about how, use the example that their ancestors who were enslaved did not want to take over the plantation. Absolutely true. You know, any of us who come from the spaces and places of transatlantic slavery in the Americas, we know this. But the story doesn't end there. And I would have loved to have seen that intellectual grapple with our ancestors didn't want to take over the plantation houses. But for instance, in the context of the US and in the post-colonial Caribbean, where I come from, what has happened is that elites have, in the moment after emancipation, in the moment where they also arrive, they have moved into the big houses. For instance, in the US, the last 14 years has been consumed with a certain kind segment of US Black population kind of obsessed with, you know, 2 years to elect Obama and 8 years in office, and then another year and a half to try to elect Kamala Harris, and now she's going to be at least 4 years in office. To think that conjuncture and to think the contradictions and the tensions between our ancestors wanted to burn the plantations down, and whenever they got the chance to burn the plantations down, they did. And in this late modern capitalist moment, populations organized around putting Black people, Black men and Black women into these powerful situations. And of course, in the post-colonial Caribbean, we know that the Black elites betrayed the working people and continue to do so. It is that kind of work and thinking that I'm feeling much more urgently for those of us who identify as being on the left, for those of us who want to make a different kind of world. Because what I'm arguing is that right now, our responses are actually capped by the horizon of capitalist culture, which is not just economic. I mean, I'm adapting that idea very much from the way in which Stuart Hall writes about neoliberalism, where Hall talks about the economic argument for neoliberalism, but Hall makes the case that neoliberalism is not just, hasn't actually been that successful, as I also say, economically, but it's been really successful in how it's been culturally successful in its managerial and administrative practices, how we manage ourselves in relationship to its horizons, how we come to think what is possible in relationship to its horizons. And thereby, I argue from that, how it has interrupted our imagination to think outside of its horizons. And that's in some ways why the language of abolition is so powerful, because the most interesting abolitionist thinkers are thinking outside of the horizon of capitalist culture. And it's at that moment that they have to be corralled, right? And they're kind of always pushing against that. So it's not so much a question of giving up. I'm less interested in our claims to identity and far more interested in how we live out from and proceed from the histories that have created us as we are.
There's can you see this question in the chat from Sabine?
Yes. Look, I think since the 60s, the question of recognition has been one that has shaped how we understand the unequal distribution of resources. And I think I've read enough Sylvia Wynter, and I think I'm so much a student of her that that she points to the 60s as both that moment of possibility and this ultimate defeat. That recognition of representation comes to be the installing of women, the installing of Black men, the installing of some gay and lesbian, we should say, white men and women, as the kind of representative figures that we were all supposed to look to and think maybe us too. That has continued apace. It has intensified in some way. So recognition, it doesn't get us out of this. And so yes, we need to break that Hegelian dynamic. We need to break out of the logic of recognition, and we need to acknowledge that that to do so, we have to narrate a different version of what the world is. That version that we need to narrate is already with us. We need to narrate a different understanding of what justice is. That justice is not representation. That justice is not Black or gay or trans or people with disability representatives sitting within all of the institutions, engaging in all of the practices that have led to the abandonment of so many others. That's not justice. So once we begin to narrate a different account, that narration in and of itself is a part of making the account that we want come into fruition. It becomes a part of the foundation of reinvention, of building a new kind of society. It becomes a part of a more, if you will, honest inter-altruism for the species, which is not to say we arrive there because we understand something about the history that has created us, right? A history that in part tells us we shouldn't cross-identify. We shouldn't allow for our cross-cultural resonance.
Can I just ask a question here? I know we're looking at the list, but this is a fascinating topic, and I've been listening very intensely. Thank you so much for a stimulating talk. I like the idea of a renewed idea of the commons, a return to that which bind communities together that seem to have been fractured at these various moments you so clearly identify in the history. And then on the other hand, we're talking here about all the challenges and limitations that make that return or that renewal to collective commons almost impossible. So I'm wondering if you could speak to some of the structures that you think need to be in place to kind of begin to prod us collectively towards a return to the commons, this arc of the moral universe that Martin Luther King talks about that bends slowly towards justice. In some ways, I think kind of speaks to what you were talking about, a return to that common, so that common good. How do you begin to build the structures for that, given all these realities, the obsession with tokenism and representation, the tendency to not entertain alternative visions of how we can arrive at the goal of justice, all these encumbering realities? How do we even begin to take the tentative steps to building these idea of a renewed commons?
I'll give you one example actually that comes from Ameil's talk, right? So Ameil laid out a really persuasive argument that I think any of us who study this stuff would see really clearly the links that Ameil made, which is, the move from how people are psychiatrized and how psychiatry becomes an extension of the carceral, and how the psychiatrized people and carceral practices find themselves embedded in questions of the border and border policing and so on. What Ameil offered us is an analysis of a set of processes that produce others. If I pick up from there, my argument then is, so how do we see ourselves in those others that are produced by that process? And so part of what's at stake here is really about, for lack of a better word, and I'm going to say a re-education of how we understand, and the word, for lack of a better word, is re-education, because I think what I'm trying to call re-education is already with us. But how do we not only do what myself and Ameil did as resting only a critique, but how it becomes a part of our lingua franca of the politics that we practice? That how we think about the world is how we make the world. So what post-Enlightenment, late modern capital has done is, it has been effective at having us think the world on its own terms. And what we have offered is a criticism of those terms, but we now have to manifest our criticism as a thought of life as well, and to proceed from there. So that might seem somewhat abstract, but it's not. There's a footnote, or I read about this a little bit in On Property. When you look at the work that many feminists of color are doing in some parts of the US around questions of violence in communities and particular forms of harm, where they refuse to engage with police as a way to adjudicate harms that have happened. What they have done is they have taken what many people understood or think or still believe is the abstract notion that you need the police to deal with harm. And instead they have said, no, we don't need the police to even deal with something that many people find as horrendous as sexual assault. We can adjudicate that within our communities. We can assign responsibility, accountability. We can assign forms of accountability without involving state police. And people are living these moments every day right now. We can live moments every day right now that breaks the chain between psychiatrization, carceral practices. We already have the language for doing it. We already have the ideas. What we don't do is bring them into the everyday quotidian of life. So when I opened the paper by saying that capitalism, at the moment that the wall fell, the capitalism was not simply no longer an economic, but also a cultural, that the economics are one and the same. I'm suggesting a similar kind of thing in relationship to how we move to a new account of the commons. That we know that to save the planet, that there's not one group of people who can be endowed with the stewardship of the planet. That's something that we're all going to have to share to save the planet. We know this. So what flows from that now has to be how we make that the everyday. And what we know and what we make the everyday is an act of will, not an act of faith. This is not a religious project, but an act of will. And that will means that we're going to have to risk something, right?
Thank you very much. That's very enlightening.
There's a question there. I'll read it out loud. It says, just as the abolition of slavery came, a moment when capitalists necessitated its abolition, is the same being reenacted now with reparations? How do we avoid this? Keeping in mind the discussion of value. Does the labor theory of value remain untroubled? Also need to be risked.
Do you want to say something to that, Ameil?
Actually, that's a very interesting question coming on a day like this, where Germany suddenly decides to pay $1 billion in reparations, or what they call it restitution, for the Herero massacre. All of a sudden, after all these decades of agitation by the Herero people of Namibia, making this officially now the first genocide of the 20th century. So in a way, what this question is really speaking to is, what is animating this sudden, discourse on reparations and restitution that we hear about, not just in the context of colonial genocide, but also even in the United States, and whose impulses are driving this new sense of urgency to come to terms with these long troubling legacies. So I think this is a very pertinent question given recent developments.
I think about, I use an example, right? Where, my great grandmother was born on a boat, bringing indentured laborers across the Blackwaters, across the Kalapuni, to work in the cane fields, to work in Guyana. It's 5 months, that journey. And, they tell us stories of, people who would bring like a small pepper plant with them, or they would try to attach a piece of history to that. And then in Guyana, in the throes of colonization, the languages and faith and religions are beaten out of you, quite literally, and supplanted with something else. I think, there are things that are extracted, things that are taken away, things that we may not be able to repair with the kinds of value that are being defined and described in some of these moments. I think what Professor Walcott was asking for, or thinking about a different kind of value that we haven't even really agreed to come up with yet, or we haven't done the work to get there yet, some of us anyway. So, I think, the ways we are trained to think of value and continue to be trained to think of value and continue to be asked to kind of give up struggles to redefine value are part of the issue. I think part of what was being discussed today, that is a site of struggle. How we determine value, who gets to speak about value, what value is, or how do we get to reconceptualize value outside of these dynamics and structures that have us contribute to the arguments that recreate the circumstances and conditions that allow for the inequitable distribution of resources and value that is extracted value from people. So I'm not saying there's no way to account for that 5 months in our history and what was taken and what was extracted and exploited. And I think Dr. Walcott was saying we need a different account of that and what's come since and what's happened because of these histories in a way that may be a broader set of solidarities that have us reconsider commons. You know, like when I was introduced to some anti-colonial, post-colonial studies, people, maybe they were clear about it, but they were trying to help us understand that most of these decolonizing struggles just happen to be nationalist struggles. And that also is a thing and a problem that we never really completely dealt with, but it's a problem that we still are running up against today. And it's one that we haven't really sorted through everywhere, that some of these nationalist struggles remake problems that we were struggling against, yet they are situated within asks where people are struggling for national identity and national recognition in different kinds of contexts. You know, we can take here, when you think about Indigenous struggles and First Nation and Métis and Inuit struggles, as different from kind of anti-colonial struggles where, you know, in India, where those national struggles turn into some of the most horrific kinds of nationalism that we've seen globally. I think all that to say, like, it leaves us with a lot to think about when you think about what's at stake and what risking looks like, and what we can imagine when we're not imagining for less, or we're not imagining for these lower asks that have been given to us for, like, a seat at X table or that kind of thing. I don't know if you want to say anything else.
Yeah. Well, in the time left, I'm wondering if I could just pose a question. It could guide the conversation, but you could also just, you know, make some concluding statement. Have we made progress? Are we making progress? Ameil, you talked about, you know, not just settling for less in the context of this conversation. And you find it in the media, you find it all around us. There's, you know, since the George Floyd incident, corporations, universities are talking the language. They're talking the talk. We can debate whether they walk in the walk. EDI has become part of our lingua franca. There's more representation, there's more consciousness. And I want to really get your assessments of people who've been doing this work for a long while. Is this progress or is this something else? How do we read this moment in the context of the longue durée, you know, that Professor Walcott just outlined? Is this a celebratory moment? Is this a turning point when that arc of the moral universe finally bends? Or do we need to pause and kind of reflect on what this might mean long-term for these struggles?
I mean, I think I'll answer your question and the question about reparations. I mean, the question of reparations is the reparations as currently being articulated both out of the Anglo-Caribbean, African-American context, continues to be based on the current global arrangements as they are. So they're largely understood as economic reparations. And let me just say this to any Black people, any people of color who have been victimized by ongoing white supremacy. If somebody's going to cut you a check, take that check and go do what you feel you must do with it. But please recognize that what's being articulated is not about creating new arrangements of how we can collectively live better together. That the entire logic of reparations is still premised within the structures of late modern capitalism. And it's still premised within the values of individualism. It's still premised within the values of capitalist scarcity. It's still right. And its logic is that economic reparations would somehow create new and viable spaces for Black life to thrive. I think that we will have to pretend and forget much of what we know about how capitalism works to ultimately see that as a liberatory gesture. Reparations as currently articulated fits very well within what I've called in my work the long emancipation. It does not point towards freedom. And I would argue that similarly with that, our contemporary response with things like EDI and so on, that what we see is that white supremacist structures, late modern capitalism, the values that undergird them are flexible. And they're flexible insofar as they realize that individual Black people or individual South Asian people or individual Indigenous people can very well sit in spaces and reproduce and participate in the reproduction of things as they actually are. So this is why the institutions that comes to constitute the way of life that we both live and not live are able to incorporate some of us in ways that no longer seem threatening. The US empire understood that a Black man could be president and reproduce empire in all of its fine detail and brutality, as well as a white man. And we're in the process of seeing that a Black identified woman, South Asian, can also engage in the same process. So those of us who have a different view of the world, a different account of the world and what it might be, we are tasked with not simply reproducing our opposition. To go back to the example that I made about Black feminists and feminists of color and the work that some of them are doing very local in communities around violence and sexual violence and so on. They have made a different world come into being in their communities. And my kind of challenge to those of us who see ourselves on the left of progressive, whatever kind of language we use, is to begin to narrate an account of the world that we work to put into place. Because the fact that we have the language to narrate it means that we can put it into place. But again, to just repeat myself, that means that we're going to have to take a risk. And that means that sometimes we're going to be disappointed. The post-colonial project to follow the work of David Scott has been fundamentally a project of disappointment. But so has been the post-civil rights project for African Americans. So has been the post-Obama moment, right? They've all been moments of, so has been the post-colonial moment for Africa and so on. Because what happens is that all of those moments still happen inside of the global arrangements of white supremacy and the post-Enlightenment project that valued us less and began with valuing us less, if not valuing us not at all. Reparations can't fix that. Economic reparations can't fix that kind of logic. That logic requires an entirely new order of understanding of how we live together.
That's probably the best way to end this event. Alongside, a sincere thank you. Thank you to the Center for Human Rights, Restorative Justice, and HCCI, and DJNO. Jama that can't be with us, Jama who's always with us, and Professor Walcott, everyone that came. This was recorded, so we'll have Bonnie will take care of this.
So let me just add too, thank you so much, Professor Walcott and Ameil, for initiating this. This has been a wonderful, wonderful conversation, enlightening, solution-focused. And thank you to those who are still with us for joining us. And I hope we've enriched your evening. So thank you very much. And hope to see you at one of our events again. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.